George Rubley was pretty much from New England. He grew up a little bit in Wisconsin. His father was an early member of the Republican Party and was actually the ambassador to Switzerland when George Rubley was a child. So he grew up in Switzerland for a while, and part of that Eastern establishment school system. He went to Groton High School. He went to Groton School, which is a famous preparatory school before going to Harvard. Didn't really want to become a lawyer, but became one by default and in the 1890s, and then became enormously wealthy through the wealthy wife that he married. The two of them invested in some tips they got on some stocks and pretty much enjoyed himself. Did some work, but not, I mean, he did some important corporation law work in the 1890s, but he really wasn't passionate about it. And around the time of the Progressive Era, around 1905, he became active as a consultant to a Republican governor in New Hampshire, and then became involved in Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 presidential campaign. After that, for the next, really from age about 40 to age 70, he becomes an advisor to presidents, both Republican and Democrat, between Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. Very involved in the Progressive Era movement. And the interesting thing about his involvement in the Jewish refugee crisis is that it's the very last thing that he does on the public stage during his lifetime. He's 70 years old when Franklin Roosevelt asks him to become the director of this committee that's supposed to try to help solve the situation for German Jews right on the eve of the war. So he's very influential in Washington and New York. He would have been very well known there in the capital class, but also the political class. Very well regarded by both Republicans and Democrats as being somebody who could work with either party, somebody who was very moderate on politics, and somebody who had a real interest in seeing something good prevail either in policy or in international affairs. He was certainly somebody who favored democracy and a political economic system which was beneficial to most citizens, and as opposed to just the capital class. He was democratic in his sentiments and we would say liberal in sentiments, in that he had certain ideas about things that were beneficial to humanity. So that was George Rubley. When the Nazis come to power in 1933, Hitler has been emphasizing an anti-Jewish policy and sentiment. He's had a fair response from a lot of rural Germans. They like that. There's a strong anti-Semitic element to not only Germany, but much of Europe going for centuries. And he played upon that anti-Jewish sentiment to help garner him support. But the people in the urban areas who supported him, who were more wealthy and saw the Nazis as someone to stop the communists, they thought maybe he was just kind of just using this for political purposes. But they soon found out that in 1934, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis began a series of policies to basically treat German Jews the way that in the Jim Crow system in the southern part of the United States, the way that the Jim Crow system treated African Americans, the Germans were now going to treat Jews that way. So they had to identify themselves. They began to control public space, and they began to have on park benches "Nicht für Juden," Jews not allowed. They stripped Jews of their citizenship rights. They forbade them from being in the professions, or if they did remain in the professions, they could only serve a Jewish population. They carried out a campaign of persecution against them. Now, that began in 1934. At the same time, we've got going on the Great Depression, and many German Jews, there were about 600,000 of them out of a population of 25 million. They wanted to get to a place where they could have refuge and maybe start life over. Many Jews had come to the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century, but immigration was largely stopped in America as of 1924 and through 26 with the beginning of these restrictive laws. On top of that, Western Europe's going through a economic crisis. There's really not a place for an immigrant to go during this period of time. So many Jews in Germany relocated to Austria, where they either had family or networks where they could find some kind of support, and they spoke the language German and Austrian. So a large number of Jews lived in Austria waiting for things to hopefully someday improve, when all of a sudden in 1938 the Germans took over Austria. And when they took over Austria, you got this Austrian Jewish population plus the Germans that had moved to Austria, and now all of a sudden the Nazis are in Austria. And they now know by 1938 what the Germans are talking about. There's Nazis like Himmler and Goebbels and Heydrich, and they are talking about the extermination of the Jewish population of Europe. So now they flee. They simply want to get out. They cross borders illegally, without passports, without visas, and they simply take their chances of going into France, going into Belgium, going into Denmark, going into Norway, going into England. Now what happens is these countries, as these tens of thousands of Jews come into their countries, they start rounding them up and putting them in holding camps, hoping to, they don't want to integrate them into their society. A lot of it has to do with the economic situation. They've got high unemployment in those countries. These Jews who have left from Germany have been forced to flee without any of their property. The Germans are confiscating their property, so they're penniless immigrants who would be a weight on any European society. That's how they saw it. They saw it in economic matters. There was also anti-Semitic feelings in France and England and Denmark and Sweden. Not Sweden wasn't involved, but in Norway and Belgium. And Germany had left the League of Nations by this point in time. There was a high commission for the League of Nations that was supposed to deal with refugees, but the League of Nations wouldn't talk to Germany, and Germany wouldn't talk to the League of Nations. So there's all these Jews in limbo and nothing to be done about it. No international organization can deal with it. So Franklin Roosevelt in the United States, President of the United States, responding to concern that he's hearing from within the Democratic Party, upper echelon, probably from the Northeast, many of whom have either Jewish relatives that live in Germany or have sentiments for them, both Christians and Jews who are really upset about the situation, and they want Franklin Roosevelt to respond and do something. The president organizes a committee to think about what can be done. And what they eventually decided to do is to have a conference in France in which they will invite the countries that had these refugees and get them to get together and talk about what can be done for these refugees. It's really Roosevelt's initiative. He's responding to the interest of American Jews and Christians who were concerned about these German Jews, but there's not much of a plan to go forward. What ends up happening is they invite the European countries in the West that had the refugees and about 20 Latin American countries. And the Latin American countries can't figure out why they're being invited. But they think, why not go to Evian, France, lovely resort village, and enjoy a conference? Well, when they're at the conference, they come to find out that the Western Europeans have German Jews that they don't want. The United States won't take them. And they're looking for the Latin and South American countries to take these Jewish people. And it looks like they want to try to figure out how to get almost all of the 600,000 German Jews to be resettled in Latin and South America. And then on top of that, other Eastern European countries that have large Jewish populations, much larger, into the millions, they start saying, hey, we want rid of our Jews too. So all of a sudden, the Latin and South American countries, once they realize what the Western Europeans in the United States want of them, they want them to take all these Jews. Latin and South America, they put up immigration restrictions too. But the conference decides to create a special committee, and that committee is going to have a director. And the job of the director is to do really two things: to get the Germans to allow German Jews to leave with a lot higher percentage of their property so they wouldn't be penniless and they would have a way to start a life, and therefore they would be more attractive to areas of resettlement. And the second job of the director was to try to get Western democracies to open up their countries to immigration. And the person that President Roosevelt appoints to do this work of negotiating with the Germans and seeking areas of resettlement is George Rubley. He'd been involved in international affairs for years. He's solved lots of problems working with Senator Dwight Morrow on very complicated international affairs. And George knew it was a thorny situation. George Rubley did. But he's 70 years old and he doesn't know if he should take the job because it is a difficult one. But I think the humane nature to him, the desire to see the Jewish population helped, the opportunity to be of service in that regard, and then also trusting his own negotiating skills and figuring out answers to thorny problems. I think he decided he would take it on. The two jobs that George Rubley had, both of them were very complicated and very difficult. For one thing, the German government didn't want to meet with this international committee looking to deal with their population. They had a very poor view of Jews, and they did not want to negotiate with any group that would highlight that. The Germans were facing an international boycott by Jewish businesses and Jewish capitalists in different countries, and also other sympathetic civil populations that were responding to this. And it was actually beginning to take a bite out of Germany's economy. And it seems that there was that issue right there that, because Hitler is gearing up for war is right around the corner. The rest of Europe knows senses we're getting there, but they don't know what Hitler does, and Hitler needs all the economic development he can before the war. So it's hard to say exactly why it takes place. I'll say this. It takes George Rubley a long time to work his way in his particular way of doing things, which is to, if you find a door closed, you find another way through it. He eventually identifies a group of German government officials who are sympathetic to the idea of a better situation for the German Jewish population. That having been said, they are the main people behind this: Helmer Schacht, the Reichsbank's president, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, but also the new economic minister. Those two, certainly Göring, if he wants to change the situation for the Jews, it's because he sees the negative consequences to Germany of the economic effects of the boycott. And he sees the advantage of basically getting the Jewish population to turn over its property worth about $6 billion in return for international funds to come into Germany to basically facilitate the immigration of these Jews. So it's economically motivated on his part. And George Rubley does eventually have some success in negotiating with a group of German officials who want to change. Now, that group of German officials, Göring and Schacht, are facing opposition from German Nazi leaders that don't want to do anything but, as George Rubley says himself in a letter to Learned Hand, there's a group here that want to exterminate the Jews. And it's really striking to see that language he uses, because that's what we know what happens later on, the mass extermination of the Jewish population during the war. And Rubley's writing to people like Judge Learned Hand, and he's saying there is a group over here that's serious about it, and they don't want to negotiate with me at all. They have no interest in changing things for the Jewish population. But through pressure from Rubley and through support from the American government to some degree, but mostly Rubley's initiative, he's able to reach out to that economic group, and under a surprising set of circumstances which he himself helps manipulate, he ends up negotiating first with Schacht and then with Göring, and actually gets a plan put forward that would arrange for the transfer of the property of the German Jewish population to a fund that would be financed by an outside group. The money would go largely to the German government that would hold it. It was a very complicated arrangement. The upshot of it was, to summarize his plan, the German Jewish population might see as much as 25% of their wealth actually ending up in their hands over time, which was better than it had been with a complete 100% flight tax. Furthermore, Rubley was able to arrange for those Jews that were too old to immigrate. He got commitments on the part of the German government that they would be left alone, they wouldn't be segregated, they wouldn't be put in ghettos, they would be not molested, they would be left to a much better treatment than they were getting during this period. So Rubley thought what he had was the best thing he could get for the Germans. He gets resistance in many quarters. Many Jews in Europe and in America, they don't like the plan because they see it as the Nazi regime getting away with basically a hostage situation by saying, you care about these 600,000 people, we want their money, and we're going to help facilitate that. From Rubley's point of view, he seems to sense that these 600,000 German Jews are in peril and that they need to get out of Germany. In fact, while he's doing negotiations, we have the Munich crisis take place, well, the Czechoslovakian crisis take place in October 38, and it's clear that Europe's on the brink of war. And George Rubley is really hoping to see these Jews get out of Germany. The irony is that he gets nowhere. He gets nowhere with regard to that second part of his job, which is getting European countries to accept Jews as immigrants. The United States doesn't relax its policies. The British Empire doesn't open up to Jewish refugees. Latin and South America don't do it either. And so the Jewish population is trapped in Europe, and the war breaks out. Nothing's done about the plan that Rubley had put into place. It's a huge failure on the part of the Western democracies to fail to come to the aid of a large number of political humans in Europe who've been targeted by hostile governments to their demise. And in fact, during the war, Jews will arrange to charter boats and try to make it to the United States. There's one famous episode called The Ship of Fools. They actually made it to America, but they were not allowed to disembark. After the war and the annihilation of the Jewish population of Europe, in the post-war period, there's an international agreement by the Western democracies that they'll never let that happen again. And we get this thing called political refugee status. And that if anyone can get to the United States and apply for asylum, they can show that their government has targeted them, then we are obliged to give these people refuge forever, perhaps as long as the rest of their lives. That's a direct result of the failure of the Western democracies to act on behalf of a group that was being hounded by anti-Semitic forces and ultimately annihilated. One thing that's not well known about George Rubley's episode with regard to the Jewish refugee crisis is that he actually manages to have one direct influence on getting Jews out of Europe. I mentioned to you that the Evian Conference, the Latin and South American countries, they closed their borders, they tightened up their immigration laws. They said as of October 1st, no more immigrants, German Jews, would be allowed to come into Argentina. And there were already 600 visas granted to German Jews who had liquidated all their property and had visas and were packed and were heading for Argentina. But they would not be arriving in Argentina before the date that was set of October 1st. And so Argentina wouldn't let them get on a ship to come to Argentina. The Argentine government wouldn't let them proceed to travel. George Rubley, who's working with the U.S. State Department, gets them very much involved in this and gets the U.S. State Department under Cordell Hull and others, Cordell Hull being the Secretary of State, to put enormous pressure on Argentina to live up to letting these 600 Jews who already have visas to let them come. And so 600 Jews leaving from Germany were able to make it to Argentina because of the direct efforts of George Rubley. And he lives till 1957, so he lives to learn about, he witnesses the destruction of the Jewish population. I know that must have weighed on him, the fact that he wasn't able to ultimately have a success, but I hope that he remembered the 600 that he was able to get out, because those were the only ones who did. The whole interwar period and the coming of Adolf Hitler to power in Germany, in the 1920s, he was just a fringe movement, far right, anti-Semitic, extreme nationalist, motivated out of anger of what happened in World War I and how the Germans entered into an armistice with the Western European powers and then were handed a peace treaty that was very harsh to Germany. And that Nazi movement starts off as a fringe movement in the 20s, but by the time we get to the latter part of the 20s and early 30s, when we get the International Great Depression, basically the center of the political spectrum evaporates, and people either go left towards communism or they go right towards a more stronger, what we would call a fascist approach. And ultimately the people of Germany are faced with a choice between communism and a far-right movement. Probably the most significant thing is that the conservative propertied people of Germany decide to go with Adolf Hitler, because he's at least created a large popular movement of lower middle class and rural people, but at least it has the appearance of a mass party, even though he's probably not polling for a long time over 20-25%. But the wealthy capital class and property class decide Adolf Hitler can protect their property from the Communist Party, which is rising up and doing quite well in the polls. And then also the rural people of Germany and the more traditionalists who want to preserve Christianity and Western German culture, they know that communism would destroy those aspects of their culture. And Adolf Hitler and the Nazis seem to be the ones who will save them. Many people ask the question, is there something that was there something that the Germans could have done to stop what happened? But I think many of them knew that there would be a war. Obviously, they see that the Jews are being treated unfairly. They're being treated like African Americans in the United States. They're told that they can't sit in certain places in public buildings. They have to have separate seating on cars. It's really interesting. We asked the question, what could the Germans have done about this regime? But the United States had that kind of regime for 70 years as far as the mistreatment of a segment of their population. That wasn't entirely new, and under the right circumstances, people accepted that. And I think the Germans accepted that. A lot of Germans didn't like it, but they didn't do anything about it because Adolf Hitler used a totalitarian police state to take out political dissidents. So you had to be quiet about if you disagreed with them. But the annihilation of the Jewish population in Europe mostly takes place outside of Germany. Germany has 600,000 Jews. I don't remember the exact percentage of that population that dies in the Holocaust, but I can tell you that it's a lot higher percentage of Jewish populations in Eastern European countries like Poland and Lithuania. Much higher percentages of their population are killed. In part because they get turned over. in part because they've been forced to live in separated, segregated societies for a very long time, and because of their dress and the way their language, they are a separate population, easier to find. But much of what happens, if not all of what happens to the Jewish population, takes place during the cloak of war. And most people were unaware of it. There are stories, though, about the camps in Germany, not too far from German villages, where they must have known something was going on there. And why didn't they stop it? But I think under the regime that Adolf Hitler had, the use of the Gestapo, the use of terror tactics, I don't think anyone wanted to risk their neck for whatever was going on behind that barbed wire fence, so they knew there was a camp somewhere. So you've basically got two populations of Jews in Eastern Europe. You've got rural people who are forced to live in Jewish-only villages, and they wear a very different style of clothing. And then you've got Jews who live in cities, like in Poland, in Warsaw. The section where Jews live is called the ghetto. In fact, the word ghetto comes from where Jews lived in Warsaw. Jews in the countryside would have no chance of resisting the German forces that are coming after them. Isolated communities without weapons and without a military background and isolated from one another cannot put forward a resistance. All you can do is hope to flee into the woods and not be caught. People in the cities had a better chance of it. But even then, the Germans moved in large numbers of troops to the SS, the death squads and such, that went looking for Jews and rounding them up. I do know that I believe it's in Warsaw, in the Jewish section, where the Jews do make a stand, and they make a real effort not to go down fighting. But it's a very difficult decision with your families to face down a fight with military in which a great number of you are going to be killed. Your family, your cousins, your children are going to die in this. You'd have to be convinced that if you surrendered to this force, that you would die anyway. And I think a lot of Jews, there were stories swirling around of what was happening to Jews, but there had been stories in World War I of such similar things that didn't turn out to be true. So in the fear of war, I think many of them, you're going to fight tanks and machine guns coming in where you've got sure death, or are you going to surrender and hope to not be treated the way you might in the back of your mind fear the worst? It's completely understandable that the Jews went with a surrender in hopes of humane treatment. So we're facing an international refugee crisis right now, especially the Syrian war. The Syrian war has led to the displacement of well over 1 million Syrians, most of whom have ended up in camps in surrounding countries like Turkey and Jordan. But a great number of Syrian families have sought refuge in Europe, well beyond the numbers that the Europeans are willing to take on an orderly annual basis. And the European countries have been struck with what to do about that. Now, Europeans have also been facing an immigration crisis coming out of Africa. But the immigration crisis coming out of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa really has to do with poverty and the lack of economic opportunity. And they've been crossing the Mediterranean trying to get into Western Europe, where they will have economic opportunities that they would never have at home. Kind of the same reason that Europeans got on boats as indentured servants in the early 1700s to come to America, where they would actually live in servitude in very difficult circumstances for at least 7 years. But they knew at the end of that time they would have a life for themselves and their children that they could never have back where they lived in Europe at the time, in the 1700s. So many of these sub-Saharan African families think we can go up there to Europe and it might be years and years of sharing apartments and working several jobs that someday my family and I will be living in a little apartment on our own someday. We'll have jobs, my kids will get a good education, and they'll have opportunities that they never would have had before. Now, so you got two sets of refugees. One are the refugees from a civil war, and the other one's for economic opportunity for the most part. And Europe's had to figure out how to deal with that. They've been less receptive to the ones who come for economic purposes, I suppose because they're not quite sure how many people would actually try to come to their country and how many that they could successfully absorb. But an amazing thing that Germany did 2 years ago nearly is, and I think it's the weight of the Holocaust on them. It's the weight of having been responsible for the deaths of so many million people and so much unimaginable suffering by humanity. The German government said, we'll take Syrian refugees who are Muslim and not from Christian European background. And we will open up our society to them, and we will settle them around our country, and we will have, in our communities and towns, we'll have citizens who reach out to them and try to get them to take on a German identity and to learn what it means to be German. It's a real gamble on the part of the German nation to do that. Many Germans are deeply opposed to it. Their ancestors were the ones who supported Adolf Hitler and didn't like Jews either. It's kind of that more rural, lower middle class, working class Germans who are opposed to Muslims the way they were opposed to Jews. But you've got a very humane, urban and middle class Germans who are willing to take a risk and willing to do the humane thing. Angela Merkel, the chancellor, is facing some difficulty for this. There's a rising right nationalist movement going on in Germany. But it appears to be that Germany, having done the most horrible thing 75 years ago, 80 years now, right at 80 years ago since the Jewish refugee crisis, 2 generations, that now they're trying to do the right thing.